Today's daf is daf Chaf Dalid in Gitin, as we learned for Shlema, for Elazar ben Reuben and Yosef ben Chaim Michal. About 10 lines down on the page, there's a 2 dots there. Isha, the Mishnah said that a woman herself, Isha Atzma, on yesterday's daf, a couple of things we learned yesterday's daf. One thing that is a correction of something that I said. Somebody asked the other day, I think Moshe might have been you, can an Evet Kanani be a shliach for a get? And I thought he could, but he can't. That's what the Gemara said, because he's not b'toras Gitin and kedushin. He's not capable of. You can't be a shliach for something. You can't be a shliach for somebody else, a messenger for somebody else, for something that you yourself couldn't do for yourself. Since an Evet Kanani cannot marry a Jewish woman, not b'toras Gitin and kedushin, can't marry or divorce a Jewish woman. Therefore, he can't be a shliach for that. So that Gemara yesterday settled that question. And I had been incorrect when I said that. I think he could. He cannot be a shliach for that. Then, yeah.
Didn't the divorce say over there that somebody else's Kanani could be a shliach?
That's for his get shichur, for freeing him against shichur, but not for a get isha. Okay, so the Mishnah said at the end of the Mishnah that a woman herself, we learned in the first 2 prakim, that a woman herself, or at the end of the second parak now, that a woman can be divorced if a shliach comes, brings a get from overseas, whether from overseas to Israel or Israel to overseas, and says then it's like 2 Adam brought it. It's like the husband cannot contest the get if the shliach comes and says then the Mishnah said at the end that a woman herself could bring the get. She herself can come from New York to Israel, bring the get, and say that's as Aisha Atzma b'yaskita. So the Gemara asked the obvious question: what do you mean she's bringing her get and saying she's not a shliach? If she got divorced already, she's divorced. She got divorced in New York, right? The husband gave her the get, and he says, "Take it to Israel." And take it to Israel. Take it to Israel for what? If he gave it to her already, she's already divorced. So what do you mean she's a shliach to bring the get? That's what the Gemara asks now. What do you mean she could be a shliach? She could be a shliach to bring her own get as long as she says but as soon as she got the get, she's divorced. If there were 2 Adam there, okay. Husband said, "I'm giving it to you, but I only want you to be divorced when you come to the Bezdin in Haifa, let's say. Only when you come to that Bezdin are you divorced." The Gemara kimata hasam. What's the difference? Okay, she's divorced. It's like he's giving her a get now, on the condition that she takes it to the Bezdin in Haifa. Okay, so as soon as she gets there, she's divorced. What's the funny nechtam like? She's a shliach saying it was written in front of me. The get took place in New York with the condition that she has to be. You're only divorced when you get there. You're only divorced when you get there. It wasn't a condition. It's chal. I'm afraid it's chal when you get there. So she's divorced as soon as she got there. Whether he said, "Look, Tiskashi el b'fnei Bezdin," maybe it only works in Bezdin in Haifa. Or he says, when you get to Haifa, it'll be retroactive, but it's mishmashmi gemara. But Omer lo tiskashi el b'fnei, I only want it to be divorced when you get there. Okay, so she's divorced when she gets there. What's the point of it? She's not a shliach. She's divorced as soon as she gets there. Okay, so you can make it tonight. I divorce you on the condition you're giving me $200 next week. You give me the $200, you're divorced. Tonight you're not. You can make a condition. So here he says, I only want it to, it's not even a condition, I only want it to be a divorce there. I'm giving it to you when you get there. When you get there, it's divorce. You're not divorced till you get there. It's not even a condition. A condition would be like, it's chal not, you give me the $200 later on. Then it's chal mafrei. You're not even saying that. You're only divorced when you get there. So what's the point of saying b'fanei nechtam? She's divorced as soon as she gets there. It was given to her in New York on the condition that she shows up at the Bezdin Haifa, and there it should be a divorce. He told the he says, you're right. In other words, is she a shliach or is she the recipient? She's the recipient of the get here. Just made a condition. I want it to be chal when you get to Haifa, not till then. So what's the shlichus over here? He says, no. It must be speaking about where he told her. Pardon?
He dies before she gets to Haifa.
That's right. It wouldn't be divorced. Right. If it would only be divorced at that point, she would, because they didn't get lachami, so we said correct. The Amalei, he told her, when you get there, snachar, put it on the ground. I'm sending you a shli. I'm ordering you or I'm commissioning you to be a shliach, to take it to Haifa. And when you get to Haifa, you're a shliach, put it on the ground and say, b'fanei nechtam, and then pick it up. In other words, the whole idea is she a shliach or is she the recipient? If she's the recipient, what's the point of saying b'fanei nechtam? No, get there, get to the Beis Haifa, put it on the ground and say b'fanei nechtam, you're a shliach, and then pick it up a shakli. Say, if that's the case, that's not a proper divorce. That's a case of pick up your get from the ground. The man says to his wife, see this get? I'm putting it on the ground. Pick it up. She's not divorced. Says for nafsan biyada, he has to give it to her. He didn't give it to her. She picked it up. That's right, because that's like giving it to her, because her property is like an extension of her hand. But if you put it on the public ground in the street and you say pick it up from there, she's not divorced. If he would throw it into her house, yes, then she's divorced, because that's like an extension. That's like a chatzar. And chatzar is because of yad. It's like an extension of her hand. But if you put it on the street, no, they're in Besdin, where it's a public place, it wouldn't work. So that's tligitach mel gakarka. Amarava tligitach mel gakarka. Rava says elsewhere later on that if you pick up a get, he says pick up your get from the street here. I'm throwing in the street. I don't want to talk to you. I don't even want to pass it over to you. Here's the street. Puts it on the ground. You pick it up. She's not divorced. It's not v'nasan. Lo amar klum. It's meaningless. Ella da amar la. So how does it work? Where is this business of a shliach? Well, how is she a shliach? She's taking it and saying who's she giving it to? She has it already. Is she divorced right away? So what's the shlichus? What is he going to say? Okay, you're a shliach, put it on the ground and pick it up. That doesn't work. Ella, the Amrla, of a shliach lo lachem. This is what he told her. I want you to be a shliach for me, taking it there until you until you get there. When you get there, you be a shliach kabbalah. My daughter asked me the other day, Rachel, can you be a shliach lo lacha and a kabbalah at the same time? Can you be a shliach for the husband and for the wife at the same time? No, you can't. This is what the Gemara says over here. You cannot. He says, be a shliach till you get there, shliach l'lacha. And when you get there, I want you to be a shliach kabbalah and accept it for you. In other words, you're a shliach for me until you get there. And when you get there, you're a shliach for yourself. Here's the point. A shlichus has to be a complete mission. I sent you to do something. You do something, and you got to be able to do it and then report back to me, even if you didn't report back, but you have to be able to report back to me and say you've done it. Over here, she can't report back to him. Why? Because as soon as she becomes a shliach l'kabbalah for herself, she terminates the shliach l'olacha. She's no longer shliach l'olacha. A shliach l'olacha, a shliach has to be somebody who says, I sent you to marry this girl for me. I sent you to purchase something for me. You're only shliach as long as you remain a shliach till you finish the job and are able to report back to me. Here, what happens to us is that as soon as she turns from being a shliach l'olacha into a shliach l'kabbalah, she voided her mission. Her mission was to be a shliach l'olacha. And shliach l'olacha, by definition, means you have to be a shliach, do your job, and be able to report back to me that you've completed your shlichus. Here, she was matal middle. Take a look at the Rashi over here. Rashi, about even where we are, right even where we are in Rashi on the right side there. Shlich lo mikra, shlich is only called the messenger elo mashlech mizel lezeh, from one to another, right? I'm telling you from one place to another, from one person to another. Sharoi lachsrei tzashach, he can go back to the one who sent him. V'lomer asisi shlichusach, I have completed your mission. I've completed. You sent me a shliach to do something or give something or buy something or whatever to somebody else. I've completed. She was sent to herself, right? I'm saying you a shliach to give it to yourself. After she became the person, the recipient herself. And the shlichus was voided before she had a chance to come back. Because as soon as she turned from being a shliach l'alacha into a shliach for herself, she voided the first shlichus. That's not a good shlichus. So that doesn't work either. So you can't say again, how does she a shliach here having to say if she was divorced already, she's divorced. If you said get divorced in Haifa, okay, so she's divorced in Haifa without being a shliach. If he said to her, put it on the ground, that doesn't work. She can't pick it up from the ground herself. If he said to her, okay, you're a shliach l'alach until you get there, and then you should be a shliach kabbalah, that doesn't work. That's not a good shlichus. The answer is the Amar law. Okay, here's what happened. He told her, be a shliach l'alach until you get, let's say, to Haifa, from New York to Haifa. When you get there, shavi shliach kabbalah, make another shliach, make a shliach kabbalah. Listen, you understand? what happens? Her husband, you have a husband and a wife. The husband said to the wife in New York, I'm making a shliach to take it to Haifa. And in Haifa, you're a shliach for me. You assign a shliach l'Kabbalah, make somebody else be a shliach l'Kabbalah for yourself, and let them accept it. So what's wrong with that, right? She's a shliach. She doesn't finish her shlichas, right? Because she remains a shliach l'Kabbalah. She doesn't turn herself from a shliach l'Kabbalah into a shliach l'Kabbalah. She remains a shliach for her husband. She assigned somebody else to be a shliach l'Kabbalah for herself. And when she gave it to that other person, she's thereby divorced. But she has to say because she is still a shliach la'alacha. She is it's true that she's the divorcee. She's going to be the one that's divorced. But at this point in time, she's a shliach la'alacha for her husband, who assigned her to give it to somebody else. She can't give it to herself, because she gives it to herself, then which she's a shliach la'alacha and the Kabbalah at the same time. She's either mavatal or shlichus la'alacha by giving it to herself, or just that she can't be a shliach halacha and a shliach at the same time. So she assigns somebody else to be a shliach l'Kabbalah. So that's okay if you hold it. You can do that. Why can't you do that? If you hold that a woman can make a shliach l'Kabbalah, in other words, a man sends in a regular case, a man sends a get to his wife with a shliach, knocks on the door and says, "I got a get for you," and she says, "You know what? That scoundrel, I don't want to accept it from you. Here, I'll make somebody else be a shliach to accept it." What's wrong with that? Or you could. That's if you say you could do that. Isha also shliach l'kabal get shliach bala. Elamandam einish shliach shliach bala. There's a shita who holds that a woman cannot make a shliach l'kabala to accept the get from the shliach from her husband. She can't do that in this case where he knocks on the door and he says, I don't want to accept. She says, I don't want to accept it myself. I make a shliach l'Kabbalah. Michael, what are you going to say? That doesn't work. Now, why wouldn't it work? Why wouldn't it work? In other words, there's a shita holds that a woman cannot make a shliach l'Kabbalah to accept it from her husband's shliach. So it's time am I? What's the reason why Mishum Beika Bizayin the Baal? Because the husband's it's a Bizayin the Baal. The husband says, I sent her a get. What? She doesn't want to accept it herself. She wants to sign somebody else. I didn't mean to give it under those conditions. I only meant to give it if you give it to her hand. If she assigns somebody else, what is she? She's ridiculing me. She's putting me down. She's too good to accept the get herself. I didn't want to divorce her under those conditions. That's the reason why, because she's embarrassing the husband, so to speak. It's she's shaming him. But here, in this case, the husband didn't mind because he himself told her, you would be a shliach l'Alacha for me. Take it to Haifa. When you get to Haifa, assign yourself a shliach l'Kabbalah and give it to that man, give it to that shliach. So here he doesn't mind. In other words, the machlokus, whether a woman can make a shliach l'Kabbalah to accept the get from her husband, is based on the idea that the husband may not want to give it to her under those conditions, but here he made the condition himself. So there's no problem. So that's fine if you say that's the reason why that shita holds that a woman cannot make a shliach l'Kabbalah to accept it from her husband's shliach, because she's sort of shaming him, and he wouldn't want to give the get under those conditions. If that's the reason, and in this case where he himself told her to do that, it's not a problem. You might say, says Rashi, what about you're saying that a woman cannot make that shita holds that a woman cannot make a shliach to accept the get from the shliach of her husband? But could she make it? There is a shliach like Kabbalah. Could she make it? She can make a shliach to accept it directly from the husband, because there, if the husband gives it to her shliach, obviously he doesn't mind. He says, "You're not home. You give it to the shliach. Give it to the shliach." If he doesn't mind, he doesn't mind. But maybe he would mind if he sent it. Maybe he would mind if he's not there and he sent the shliach to give her a get, and she says, "I'm not taking it myself. I'll assign a shliach to do it." Maybe he wouldn't want to give it under those conditions. Fine, but over here he doesn't mind because he assigns it. Pardon? Not a tonight. No. We're afraid. No, we're afraid. He said to the shliach l'Alacha, take this get, give it to my wife. Now, if she assigns a shliach, he might say, I didn't want to give it under those conditions. Not a tonight. That wasn't his intention. That was his intention was to give it directly to her. He didn't want to give it, or he didn't want a shliach to give it to a shliach. No. Even if he didn't say that, even if he didn't say it. If we said before that could be if he said to give it only in St. Louis, Mara Makamula, he's only showing her where, but maybe he wouldn't mind anyway. But over here, we're concerned that maybe he didn't want to give it to a shliach. Maybe he said, "Oh, she's trying to shame me. She doesn't want to accept it herself. Maybe he wouldn't want to give it." Pardon?
Too bad for him.
It's not a question of too bad. The question is, she's an aguna. He didn't really want to give her the divorce. If no, but he didn't want to give it under those conditions. Those are the conditions.
That's what I'm saying. The condition is.
Yeah, but it's an understood condition according to that. It's a machlokas about it. One shita says no, he could make a shliach. That's how we pass. A woman could make a shliach to accept the get from her husband. There's a shita who says that she can't make a condition because maybe he didn't want to give it under those conditions. Therefore, it's not a good get. You can't say too bad for him. If a man says, "I'm giving you the get on condition that you give me $200 next week," next week she says, "I'm not giving you the $200." What are you gonna say? Too bad. It's divorced anyway. No, she's not divorced. Now she's stuck. She can't get remarried, and he doesn't want to live with her anymore. So if you say that's the reason, there's another reason why. And there's another reason brought down why that shita holds that a woman, when she gets the knock on the door, says, "I'm not going to accept it. I'm going to make a shliach to accept it." And he says, "That's no good," is because it's similar to a chasur lo memka. What's a chasur lo memka? We had that the other day. Let's say a man writes a get, and he's at his friend's house. He's consulting with, think I should divorce or not. They write a get, and he leaves it in his friend's chutzner. She then buys the chutzner. She divorced? No, because he didn't put it in her chutzner. Chutzner is like if it's her chutzner, it's an extension of her hand, like he gave it to her. But here she bought the chutzner afterwards. She didn't get divorced. He didn't give it to her. If everything is kosher, a man writes a get, and it's for her, and it's lishma, and we can see the next mishmah lishma. He wrote it for her, and he intended to give her everything, and he wasn't sure what to do, and he left it on the ground. He left it in shul one day. She comes into shul. He left it here in this section. This is the women's section. He left it here. She comes into shul and picks it up. She's not divorced. She says, "Look, I got a divorce of mine." Yeah, but it wasn't given to you. So that's the question over here too. Here we're afraid that's similar. If she assigns a shliach when she gets the knock on the door, that she knows that's not a good shliach because it's xera, right? It really would be a good get, but the xera, we're afraid if you say that's a good get, if she buys a chutzah that has her get in it, you might say that's good too. So according to that, Michael Maimer. So over here, what's your solution? Again, what's the case here? A woman can bring her own get from Dina Siyam to Haifa, but she has to say as a shliach, and she has to say, "What do you mean? If she has to get already, she's divorced?" No. He told her, "I want you to take it to Haifa, and there I want you to assign a shliach lekabbalah, right? Shliach lekabbalah, and you give it to the shliach lekabbalah. You're my shliach. You give it to your shliach lekabbalah, and then it's good." But there's a shita holds you can't do that. You can't assign a shliach. Maybe the husband won't like that, or maybe chatzol levav me'achadikan. So he told her like this: "The Amar law. Here's the final answer. The Amar law. Have a shliach lachat matzah hasam. I want you to be a shliach for me until you get to Chayva. V'chimatos hasam. When you get there, shavi shliach lo locha. Make another shliach lo locha. A shliach can make another shliach. I'm telling you, in fact, sometimes it's a question: could he make a shliach without the consent of the mishalech? That's already a shaylik, and maybe the mishalech didn't want him to do that. But over here, the mishalech, the husband said, "I'm sending you to Haifa. When you get to Haifa, you're a shliach lo locha. I know the halacha. You have to be a shliach. I know the halacha about halacha, right? I know the shliach. You're a shliach till you get to Haifa. There, I want you to assign a second shliach in front of the bezdin, and you say b'fanei nechtam. The second shliach can't say b'fanei nechtam. He's in Haifa. You were in New York. You saw it. You saw me give it to you, and you saw me write it and everything. Give it in front, write it in front of Adam, and you saw them. They saw you being assigned to take it there, and you could say b'fanei nechtam. So when you get there, assign another shliach lolacha, b'kabel yizgetach minei, and then he will give it to you. So you're a shliach lolacha. You're not being mevatel your shliach lolacha by giving it to yourself. You're making another shliach lolacha. So at that point in time, you could report back and say you've done your shlichus. You've signed another shliach lolacha. Then he in turn gives it to you. That's how you'll get your get. That's one. That's how this could work in our Mishnah. Of course, he could just give it to her in New York and say you're divorced. That's it. I'm giving you your get to Adam, and you're divorced there. The divorce doesn't have to take place in Israel. It could be anywhere. People are divorced anywhere in the world. People say more. I could say the Amar law. You could say it in this one. I want you to be shliach for me until you get there. But when you get there, Aimer kame beidina, say in front of the bezdin, in front of the bezdin, umeshave beidina shliach, and make the bezdin a shliach for you. Right? Let them give it to you. Let them make a shliach, or let them be the shliach, and they will give it to you. So that's how it works in our Mishnah. A woman can be a shliach for her own get and say b'fanei. Why does he say b'fanei? Because it's shliach la'alacha. She didn't want her to be divorced. If he wanted to be divorced, if he says, listen, I'm giving you the get here, and as soon as you get to Haifa, as soon as you step into the city limits, you're divorced. Okay, that was the condition. She's divorced as soon as she gets it. She doesn't say b'fanei nechtam because she's divorced already. B'fanei nechtam is when a guy comes from overseas, or in this case, a woman comes from overseas. How do we trust them that it's okay? The Edom are overseas. We don't know if it's written Lishma, etc. The answer is the shliach. If he says b'fanei nechtam, he's believed like to. That's our mission. That's the end of the second parak. Maybe get. Now we begin the third parak. We've learned before. It says because of law, Lishma has to be written for her. It has to be written for him and for her. It's got to be Lishma. And what has to be written Lishma, as we'll see, the Torah, the main part of the thing, not the boilerplate, but the point that talks about when his name is mentioned, her name is mentioned, the city that they're from, the date. Those are things called the Torah. It has to be written for that person, for that individual. Now we'll get into issues. What happens if two people in the same town have the same name? Reuben is divorcing Leah. For simplicity, we'll just say Reuben, like Reuben ben Reuben, and Leah bas Leah, whatever. And let's say Reuben's giving it to Leah, and what happens wasn't really written for the right Reuben. So here the mission says, Kol get shenuchim sholosh shemisha, who was written not for that particular woman, puzzle is no good. It's no good. We'll talk later on. When we say it's puzzle, does that mean it's no good at all? And if he gave it to her, she can still marry a Kohen because she's not, I mean, it's no good, she's not divorced, but eventually, if the husband dies, subsequently, can she marry a Kohen? Is it like a divorce or not? We'll talk about that. What's an example? We're going to give several examples. A man was walking through the marketplace. When he heard scribes, people were writing gitin there. Makrin, they were dictating. Ish ploni megarishas ploni is makom ploni. This man, Reuben's divorcing Leah from New Orleans. He's divorcing her. And he said, hey, that's my name. I'll use that get. Hey, that's for me. I'll take that one. You mentioned my name and my wife's name. I'll take it. Why? Because it wasn't written for that individual. It was written by scribes who were writing boilerplates. Okay. Yes or mikan. I'll tell you a bigger finish. Here was written. It was written by this man, Reuben, and he wrote it for when he wrote it. It was for this Reuben number one, and he wrote it for his wife Leah number one. The Nimlach, he decided he's not going to divorce her now. He found somebody else in the city with exact same names, Reuben ben Reuben and Leah bas Leah, right? Whatever, same names as him. Found somebody in his town. He said, Shmi kashimcha, my name is same as yours. I'll tell you what, you want to get divorced? I'll save you the, if you go to the sofa, he'll charge you $100. I'll give it to you for $50. I'll give it to you for free. It's got the right names in it. Wrong person. It was written for Reuben number one and Leah number one, and you want to use it for Reuben number two and Leah number two, who happen to have the same names, and they're from the same city. Okay, that's Pasal Gashbo. Why? Because it wasn't written for the right person. That we can understand. Okay, that's case number two. Case number three, yes, a bigger fish. A man has two wives with the same name. His own man married two wives, and he liked the name Leah. He married Leah number one and Leah number two. They're both his wives. Yes, they're the same names. Let's say he wrote it to divorce Leah number one. Let's say the older one. He can't use it to divorce them too. Now, what's the chiddush here? It was partially lishma, right? Because it was written for him, right? Reuben, it's only one Reuben here, and it was written for him. But he wrote it for wife number one. He can't use it for wife number two. Can he use it for wife number one? He wrote it for wife number one, right? Can he use it for wife number one? We'll see. We'll see. Can he use it? Yes, but later on when it's taken out in court, right? And she says, look, I'm divorced, right? They might say, wait a minute, how do we know it's written for you? Maybe it was written for your co-wife with the same name, right? It was written Lishma over here, but maybe it should be. So we'll see. So if he wrote it for wife number one, can't use for wife number two. Yes, we got a bigger fish. He told the scribe, I have two wives by the name of Leah, both have the same name, and I'm not sure, I can't take it anymore with two wives in the house. I want to get rid of one of them. I'll decide next week which one. Let's see how the Shabbos goes, right? You can imagine what Shabbos like. Yes, we can. Garish. Write it for whichever one. I'll decide later on which one. It's written for me and for my wife Leah. I haven't decided which Leah. Later on, I'll decide then I meant to do Leah number 1 or Leah number 2. This goes into the question of what? Of Brera. Can you do something later on? And that action later on will work retroactively to now. That's also Pasal Gashbo, because we say Ein Brera. You can't say that later on I'll decide. It meant that retroactively when the Sofer wrote it, he wrote it for the right one. That doesn't work. So all these cases don't work. So the Mishnah Gemara now explains. Pasal Gashbo Ishav Nimlach Velavation B'mai. I understand. He wrote it to divorce his wife. The second case, he wrote it to divorce his wife, and he changed his mind. And he didn't want to divorce his wife, but he found somebody else in the city with the same names. They can't use that. So what's the first case? The first case is Hayover B'Shuk, and he wrote it. What's the difference between the first case and the second case? In both cases, it wasn't written for the guy who's using it for divorce. In the third and fourth cases, it's written for him. The right Reuben is getting divorced. The question is, which wife is he going to give it to? Right? Can he exchange his mind and give it to the other wife, or can he tell the Sofer, I'll decide later on? But in the first case, what's the difference between the first case and the second case? In both cases, it wasn't written for the right guy. So Kosel Gash, what's the first case speaking about? Amar Papa, the Sofer assuming the Slam and Askinim. It wasn't talking about where a guy was walking by in the street and he heard Reuven writing a get for his wife Leah, and he said, "Oh, that's the same one. I'll take it instead." Right? No, that's not the case. The first case is speaking about where the scribes weren't even writing it for anybody in particular. They were just writing boilerplates, The Sofer assuming the Slam, they're doing it for teaching purposes, for practice. They were stagiaires, whatever they're called, right? Stagiaires, right? The Sofer assuming the Slam, they were being trained. Amarashi, Dekanami, you see that also the Tani Sofer Makrin, it says the Sofer were dictated. Below Tani Sofer, it doesn't say they were reading, they were dictating. In other words, they were dictating. One guy says, okay, write it for this one, write it with this name, try this name, I'll see how you make the nun there, see how you write. Shema Min obviously. My yes mikan. So what in each case we said, I'll tell you a bigger finish. What's the yes mikan in each case? Right? We said first case says he was walking by and he heard from learning, right? He went to the school. I remember when we were young, there used to be a barber school, for that you get a free. You pay $1, you get a haircut. That's if you got it from the teachers. From the students, it was 60 cents for a haircut. And if it was a new student, it was $0. You got it for free, but you look that way too. So the yeshiva guys would get that, right? So, so the first case is speaking about they were just stagiaires, right? So Amravashi, they can self mark below Tani self and didn't reach Shmamina. Okay, my yes we can. Tani Rebbe Shmuel, Lo Zeshinith of Solishim Gerishim. Not only the first one, there wasn't even written for a get. The first case when they were studying, right? They were learning, they were stagiaires, they were learning how to write. They weren't even writing it for a get, they were just practicing. Not only that one's no good, the second case is speaking about where Reuben wrote it for his wife Leah, then he changed his mind, he's not going to divorce her. Found somebody else in the same town with the same names, gave it to her, but at least it was written for Gerushin. It was written for the first Reuben. It was the intention when Reuben wrote it was to divorce his wife, so it was written for a real divorce. Why? Because it wasn't written for that person who's using it to divorce his wife. It was written for a different Reuben and Leah. Not only the second case where it wasn't written for his own Gerushin, right? What happened in the second case? Reuben number 1 wrote it for Leah number 1, and then Reuben number 2 and Leah was going to use it to divorce Leah number 2. So it wasn't even written for the Reuben number 1, but in the third case it was written for Reuben number 1. Reuben number 1, there was only one Reuben in the third case. He had 2 wives, both with the same name, Leah bas Leah and Leah bas Leah. He called them number 1, number 2. Right? How do you call them? Right? Number 1, number 2. But it was written for him. Also is possible because it wasn't written for the right woman that he's divorcing. Right? Not only for this one that wasn't written in number 3, it wasn't written for this Gerushin because he wrote it to divorce Leah number 1 and he wants to use it for Leah number 2. It was written for this one, also possible, right? My time. Okay, my time. So now we're going to say, but even this one, notice in the fourth case, it was written for the right one. What happened? He said to the Sofer, I have 2 wives by the name of Leah. Write it now and I'll decide next week which one I wanted it for. And next week, when I decide, that will be the one that you wrote it for. So we say, Ein Brera. What's the reason? So he explains now each case. Also, for my time, if it would only said, B'nasan Sefer Krisis Biyada, if the pasuk would say, give her a Sefer Krisis, that would exclude the first case, that wasn't the love of the Shem Krisa. The first case was written for students. It wasn't written for cutting it off all. It wasn't written for the purpose of divorce. It was only written to learn, to study, to train. But if you wrote it for his own wife, Reuben wrote it for Reuben number one, wrote it for Leah number one. The Nimlach, and he changed his mind. Double Shem Krisa. It was at least this get was written for divorce, right? When Reuben number one wrote it for number two, for Leah number one, he meant to divorce her. So the get itself was written for the purpose of divorce. No, the one who is divorcing his wife, he has to write it. You can't use a get or have it written. You can't use a get written by somebody else for their divorce, right? Even though that meant to be divorced. Reuben number one wrote it for Leah number one. Reuben number two can't use a get that Reuben number one wrote. It's got to be written by Reuben number two, written or commissioned to have it written. So because of Rahman it would exclude the second case. Why? Because he didn't write it. If a man has two wives, both of the same name, he wrote it. He wrote it for Leah number one. He might be able to give it to them too, because it says because of he wrote it. He himself wrote it. It's written at least for him. So Rahman Allah Lishma. It's got to be written for this particular woman. So if you wrote it for Leah number one, you can't give it for Leah number two. The Sefer Lami. So what do I need the last case for? Where he said to the Sofer, write it for one of my wives, and I'll decide later on which one. We don't say that. We don't say brera. In other words, we hold that ain brera, even though we'll say if you hold brera, the Gemara is going to say even if you hold brera in other cases, here you don't say brera. In other words, there are cases of brera. The famous case of brera is a man said a man didn't take Trumas and Maisus on his wine, and he wants to make Kiddush Friday night. So he says I'll take Trumas and Maisus after Shabbos. It should be the Trumas and Maisus that I take out of the barrel on Matzah Shabbos or Sunday morning. That should be the Trumas Ma'aser, and the rest I'm drinking right now. So do we say that works or not? So the Shiur is a machlokas whether it works. And if you say brave, says no, it doesn't work. You're going to say that when you take the cup of wine on Sunday morning, loy milsum afrei, it turns out retroactively that was the one that you designated. We don't say that. Others say that it does work, but we're afraid you shouldn't do it because maybe the barrel will break and comes out. If you didn't give it at the end, if you didn't give it Sunday morning because it all ran out, drained out, then you're stuck, right? It turns out that you drank wine that wasn't Trumas and Maisus were not taken from there. All right, so we have this issue, and we say Kamashmon that ain brera, and here he says the ain brera. No, they say ain brera. Okay, that and we'll see even if you hold of cases of brera that it does work. In another case, here we see ain brera. Okay, so now let's go back to these cases. We said in the third case, he had two wives, both with the same name. If he wrote it for the elder one, you shouldn't give it to the younger one. If he wrote it for Leah number one, you shouldn't let it to. Tanahudalo must you can't divorce number two with it. Hagdola must but he could use it for number one. Now, what's the Shiloh? Why shouldn't he be able to use? He wrote it for number one. Why can't he use it for number one? He said you could use. You can't use it for number two, but you could use it for number one. But there's a problem with that, right? Amaravas of Samaris, it shows from here the Shiloh Shnei Yosef and Shimon. Adorm Birachas Matzin Shachov Alacherim. Two people with the same name, Yosef ben Shimon. Yosef ben Shimon, they both have the same name. And it says over there that Yankel borrowed money from them. Yosef ben Shimon has a star that says that that Yankel owes him $100. He goes over to Yankel and he says, Yomi $100, here's the star, I owe you. So Yankel could say, wait a minute, no, maybe I borrowed the money from the other Yosef ben Shimon. It's true, I owe the money, but not to you, maybe to the other guy. We're assuming maybe used this Yosef ben Shimon, the first Yosef ben Shimon that the other Yosef ben Shimon dropped the IOU, and this guy picked it up. You don't go that far. You don't go that far because you don't assume that maybe it fell down. It fell down. And Yosef ben Shimon comes along and says, I have an IOU. You owe me money. There's only one Yankel in town. You owe me the money. He's got to pay. It says, Yosef ben Shimon, meaning the same thing over here. We said that he has two wives, two Leahs, right? If he wrote it for Leah number one, you can't use it for Leah number two. That would be a problem with Lishma, right? But he could use it for number one. Why? When number one says, look, I'm divorced, people could say, look, maybe it was meant for your sister, for your co-wife. The answer is we're not concerned about that. You're not concerned that maybe you gave it to the co-wife, she dropped it, and you picked it up. We're not concerned about that. Amalei Abaye, if that's the case, what about the second case? Amalei Abaye, when Reuben number one wrote for Leah number one, he decided not to divorce her. He gave it to Reuben number two to divorce Leah number two. There we say that's no good. Reuven number 2 can't use it. But Reuven number 1 could use it. How can he use it? If he divorces his wife with it, maybe why aren't you concerned that maybe it wasn't written for them at all? Maybe if he divorced it because there is a Reuven number 2 and a Leah number 2 in the same city, maybe they could claim that she says she's divorced. She's not really divorced. Maybe it was written for the other ones, right? If that's the case, what are you going to say over there? Right? You see, if 2 Yosef and Shimon's are creditors in the city, 2 Yosef and Shimon's, and one of them comes with a shtar and says, "You owe me $100, Yankel," you have to be able to collect. But let's say there's a credit. Yankel's the creditor, and it says that Yosef and Shimon owes him $100, and he comes to Yosef and Shimon and says, "You owe me $100." Says, "I don't owe you the money. The other guy owes you." Yeah, you could say that. How do you know it's me? Right? You have a shtar. You say that Yosef and Shimon. My name's Yosef and Shimon. You have a shtar that says that Yosef and Shimon owes you $100. It wasn't me. It was the other guy. I'm not going. Didn't fall. I'm not concerned that maybe it fell and you picked it up. The wrong guy picked it up. No, I'm not the guy that it came from. There, everybody says if so how could it be that Reuven wrote a divorce for his wife Leah? He gave it to the other Reuven, and that guy can't use it because it wasn't Lishma. But the first Reuven says could use it even though it was written Lishma. How could he use it? How do you know who got divorced? Maybe the other guy divorced his wife, not you. So, very good. That's what the Gemara says. So how does it work? The fact that, in other words, if a woman says, "I'm divorced, here's my divorce. My husband's Reuben, here's my divorce." Wait a minute. How does this prove it's you? Is your 2 dots of hood on there? How do you know it's divorced? There's somebody else in the same city with the same name. You and your husband have the same name as you and your husband. How do you know a divorce? The answer is in that case, B'Eda Masira. What must you say in that second case where there's 2 Reubens and 2 Leahs? There's Eda Masira or Blazer. It goes like a Blazer. You have to look at the Eda Masira. The Edom who were there gave it over. We said before in Chapez and Beis, you have the day stop that according to Blazer, you don't even need written Edom signed on her at all. And if it's questioned, you have to find those Edom who saw it take place. And that's what happened over here too. It works only because Eda Masira. They know which Reuben and Leah it was. I'm asking, maybe Eda Masira or Blazer. So in this case also, not only in the second case, but in the third case too, where one man had 2 wives, Leah. But Leah number 1, Leah number 2. So you can't, if you wrote it for Leah number 1, you can't use it for Leah number 2. If you wrote it for Leah number 2, you can't use it for Leah number 1, but he could use it for the one he wrote it for. What about the fact that, does this prove that if 2 Yosef and Shimon's each one can make a claim that they, on this Yankel, each one, Yankel can't say to them, "No, I'm not the one who borrowed, that I borrowed it from the other guy. I borrowed money from the other guy." You say, no. You could claim that maybe it fell. So you could say here also, B'Eda Masira or Blazer. The way it works is a Blazer, and the same thing will be by the case of the money being lent. That if Yosef and Shimon comes to Yankel and says, "You owe me $100," and it says that in the shtar, maybe you could say, "No, I borrowed it from the other guy," unless there's Edom who saw it. Amrav Kulan. Now, all these cases, there's 4 cases in the Mishnah. The first one with the students. The second one, 2 Reubens, 2 Leahs. The third case, 1 Reuben with 2 Leahs, and he wrote it for one. He can't use it for the other one. And the 4th case was a case of Breira, where he said, "I'll decide later on," just like the 3rd case, but I'll say later. Amrav Kulan Posmakuna. Let's say you gave that get. She can't marry Cohen afterwards, even though she's not divorced. Right? If Reuben number 1 wrote it for Leah number 1, he gave it to the other Reuben, and he used for his wife, it's no good. But you know what? She still can't marry a Cohen. Why? Because it's called Reach Haget. Now, what's the case of Reach Haget? We'll see later on. If a man says to his wife, "I'm divorcing you, but you can't marry anybody else. I'm divorced from you, but you're divorced, but you can't marry anybody else." Is that a good get? She can't marry a Cohen. She can't marry. It's not really divorce, but she can't marry a Cohen. It's called the Reach Haget because it says Isha Grusha Isha Lo Yikachu. Even if she's divorced only from her husband, not mutter to marry anybody else, that's also again. It's called the right? Yeah, of course. If he dies subsequently, she can marry Cohen. Right. And she's possible to marry Cohen. So Rav says, you know what? All these cases you're possible to do. Chutzman or skip the first one because the first one's not even a get. It was just written for students. It was practice. It doesn't mean anything. Ushmuel Mafri Shanami post the first one also. Baza Shmuel Shmuel goes according to his reason. Damar Shmuel Kom Makom Sheshanu Chacham get puzzle. Whenever the Chacham said it's puzzle, Posel. It's not a good get, but it also ruins her from marrying a Kohen ever again in the future. Chalitza psul. Let's say you did chalitza. That's no good. You did it with the left foot, or you did it at night. It's posel. It's not a good chalitza, but psula posel, but she can't marry the brothers anymore. It's kivin shelo bana shuvlo yivna. Pasuk is kachei shelish shel yivnas beisachil, right? Kivin shelo bana shuvlo. Once you've done something wrong, you've pushed her away. You can't marry anybody else. In other words, if let's say what happens, a man dies with no children, and the second brother Shimon did chalitza up psula, it's not a good chalitza. Did it with the left foot. He did it at night, whatever. In that case, it's not a good chalitza, but she still can't marry any of the brothers subsequently. So that's the same idea. That any Shmuel, it's any time when the Chum say a get is possible, it's possible, but it ruins her from marrying. Going the same thing, the chalitza is possible, it possibles her from the brothers. When Rav and Eretz Yisrael, they said Mishmeid Rabbi Lazar, small v'layla psula supposes. Only if you did it with the left foot or at night, then it's possible and it ruins her. But if it was no chalitza at all, for example, it was done by a katan, chalitza has to be done by a bar mitzvah. He has to be. We learn Mrs. Chalitza in the parak Kuf Gimel. I think it starts in Yevamas. He's got to be bar mitzvah, right? Cotton or vantil. You didn't do it with a shoe. You did it with like a cloth slipper. That's psulas vein apostles. It doesn't ruin it from anything else. It's not even chalitza. It's just a joke. It's nothing. Ziri says no. Kulan ain postlin. None of them possible. In other words, if Reuben wrote it for Leah number 1. And then he gave it to Reuben number 2 to give it to Leah number 2. It doesn't possible at all. Chutzman achar, except the last case. What's the last case? Write it for whichever one of these wives I'll decide later on. They both are the same names. I'll decide next week which I want to give it to. Then it does possible her from marrying a Kohen in the future. Rabbi Yochanan says af achar nami ain't a posel. Even the last one doesn't possible. In other words, yes, the case of a man says to his wife, "I'm divorcing you." And he wrote it for her, right? Gave it to her. And he gave it to her. And he says, "I'm divorcing you. You can't marry anybody else." The other Gemara says that's a real reach again. And she's prohibited from marrying a Kohen in the future. But in these cases, no. This wasn't written for her. And braver doesn't work.
How could this get work at all? She's still chained. Didn't we learn Yavamas?
She's still chained. She's still chained. But if the husband dies now, can she marry Cohen in the future? That's the issue. Can she marry Cohen in the future? Is it
why is it?
Of course, no. She's not divorced from her husband.
Okay.
In any case, she's not divorced from her husband. According to everybody, the Mishnah says none of these cases work. Right? She's not divorced from her husband. The question is, if the husband subsequently dies, can she ever marry a Cohen? If the husband divorces her again in the future, then for sure she can't marry a Cohen. But I mean, if the husband subsequently dies, is she prohibited from marrying a Cohen? If a woman is divorced, even if she marries 100 times and all those other guys dies, once she's divorced and she can't marry a Kohen in the future. Here we're talking about, could she marry a Kohen in the future? And Rabbi Yochanan says none of these cases ruin her from marrying a Kohen in the future because they're not a get at all. It's not even what we call a rechik. It doesn't even smell like a get. Listen to this case. So let's say brothers divided a Yerusha. They had a Yerusha. The father left them many acres of fields. And there's, let's say, 3-4 brothers. They divide it up. What happens in Yovel? Is it still divided up the same way, or is it like a purchase, which goes back to the original owner in Yovel? So here also, goes back to the father, so to speak, in Yovel, and then they resplit it. They re-divvy it up, maybe in a different way. So Rabbi Yochanan says, saying they're like they bought it, and they give it back in Yovel, and then they redivide it. They redivide it, not necessarily going to the same people. They divide it, maybe there are 4 brothers, field number 1, 2, 3, 4. In the first division, Reuben got number 1, and the second division after Yovel, maybe he gets number 2. So what's the idea there? What's the idea? And we don't say Brera. Listen to this. We don't say Brera. We don't say, well, that was the field that he was meant to get. We don't say that. It's like you bought it. So he's telling you in both cases. So he's telling you, Rabbi Yochanan says, even the 4th case, the other cases where it's written for writing or written for the wrong guy or for the wrong woman, for sure it's not a get. Even in the last case, where it was written for the right person, I said, give it to whichever one of these 2 wives. I'll decide next week. Later on, they decided next week. So he really was for that person. It's no good because of Brera. The same thing over here. And Gemara says, you need to tell me both cases, both the cases of purchase, that you don't say Brera there, but you say it's like they have to give it back in Yovel. It wasn't meant to, field number 1 wasn't meant for Reuben. Rather, you give it back and start on the street. You need both cases. Maybe in this case, because of law has written for her, At the time of the writing, it has to be written for her. Here, at the time of the writing, the scribe didn't know who he was going to give right for. He said to give it for one of these two wives. He didn't know who was going to be written for. So therefore, you say, okay, there you say it's ein brera, right? They say ein brera, and there why? Because you need law lishma. Avalasam mecher, that's a sale. Dam Rachmana said like that dividing up a field of Yerusha, an estate, is like a sale. Dam Rachmana, lahada maybe should go back in Yovel. Aval Yerusha umatana lo. In other words, where do you say what? Not the sale. I said it wrong. Maybe in this case, because it's by the get, it's no good because it says lo lishma. But hasam mecher hu dam Rachmana lahada v'yovel. The Torah says that a sale goes back in Yovel. You sell me your field, your family field goes back in Yovel. Aval Yerusha matana, an estate or a gift maybe doesn't go back. So the Kamash one though that it also goes back. Says Rebecca, that also goes back in Yovel. It wasn't meant for you. V'yashmin and started Mishim l'chumra. L'chumra will say, okay, Machzir, you give it back l'chumra. Even if you're not sure, you go l'chumra and say, you know what, we're not sure if the field goes back in Yovel or not. Give it back and redivide it up. But to say that the get doesn't possible is a kula. In other words, to these four gitin, or the case of the brera, the last case, to say that it's not a get is a kula, meaning she's not divorced, is a kula because she can marry a Kohen now. It's not a divorce at all. Yeshmin asada mishum l'chumra. There we said l'chumra, give it back and divide it up again. Inami ketchila, let it go back like the original case was. But over here, maybe we shouldn't be mekel, and maybe we should say she still can't marry a Kohen anymore. Mashma, no, we say ein brera, and she can marry a Kohen. This is not a get at all. And just like the sale, just like the fields go back in Yovel, because we don't say it was meant for this guy. We don't say brera. The same thing by the get also, we don't say brera. Tomorrow's Gemara is all about brera. The whole issue of brera is it's all about. And on Sunday, we'll pick it up from the Mishnah on Chavav and Aleph, and tomorrow's Daf will be on the podcast. Have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Oh, good Shabbos, beautiful.